Hey guys, welcome back to another Q&A. It is Sunday, January 23rd, 2022. We will dive right in. Good variety of questions today, so let's start from the top. Someone asks, higher fats versus higher carbs when building muscle, pros and cons of each. I'm probably going to more so look at, from a digestive standpoint with that and see, which of those energy substrates do they digest the best, and then kind of work on that. Obviously, fats will digest slower than carbohydrate, depending on the types, but overall fats are going to digest slower. So that may be a consideration as food gets higher, right? So that's one portion of it. Well, secondly, what do they feel best with? Probably what they digest best is probably what they feel best with, right? So that's another consideration. But beyond that, we're talking nuance. You can store carbohydrate as fat. Technically, it's a little bit more of a process than storing fat as fat. But when we have an abundance of energy, aka calorie surplus, we are going to gain body fat to some extent. Even if we're in a 200 calorie surplus, just arbitrary example, we could use 150 calories of that allocated towards building muscle tissue. We would still be storing that other 50 somewhere, right? Probably not in glycogen or intramuscular triglycerides, because those are probably already full if you've been in a surplus for a while. So you're probably storing, you're probably filling up adipose cells, right? For all intents and purposes, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, just more so what you feel best using. But I wouldn't say restrict one heavily over the other, because they obviously both have benefits. When women produce higher levels of free testosterone, does this lead to fat storage in the abdomen? Is the only way to correct this to reduce that free test level? They're specifically mentioning free test, which, it doesn't necessarily mean they have high total test, but if they have high free test, then we know that they either A, have high total test and equal amount of free test by ratio, or B, they have normal total test and low SHBG and they have high free test. So the question first would be do they have high total test, which is leading to high free testosterone? That's one scenario. Or that's probably more common scenario, right? Or do they have normal test and low SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, so they have a high amount of free available testosterone? That would be scenario 2. In scenario 2, you would want to ask, why do you have low SHBG? That could be related to your thyroid, related to some kind of nutrient deficiency or insulin. So that's the question that I would be asking there, right? It's why do we have an abnormal amount of free test versus total test, right? Because you're not supposed to. SHBG is supposed to designed to control that, in a reasonable ratio with total, right? So you'd want to think, well, if that's the case, then again, that would be the target. Why do we have this high SHBG? We need to work on that, and that would correct it, right? If you have a high total test, then that's a different scenario. That's PCOS, perhaps. I'm not, obviously I don't know much about this person, so it's kind of hard for me to speculate. We have a weird lighting situation here. Let's go for a little bit. There we go. You'd have to answer that question first. Now, yeah, you may potentially see some male pattern fat gain. If you're gaining fat, you may see some male pattern fat gain because of what the fat cells are more sensitive to. Look at it. You ever seen a guy has the belly, has the skinny limbs, little butt? Yeah. That's kind of, you can have that. You look at PCOS, look at hyperandrogenism, that's what you generally see. You generally see fat around the midsection. You generally see not as much fat around the lower body, which is more of a female fat holding pattern, right? So there's certainly a hormonal component to it, but it's not directly making you gain fat. Obviously, that's more of a caloric balance problem. So, but if you have a thyroid issue that's throwing off your SHBG, plus you have this testosterone imbalance and you're gaining fat and you're in a calorie surplus, then yeah, you've got yourself a situation. But yeah, there's to be a few questions answered there first. Would utilizing metformin post-workout with a huge bolus of carbohydrate during a gaining phase be beneficial, even though the research indicates it cranks down mTOR? Would use of PEDs cancel out this hypertrophy blunting effect, seeing as they are being taken exogenously? This question has been asked a million times in different, some way, shape, or form, right? Can you take metformin and grow muscle, essentially? Well, the first thing is like metformin works in a couple ways. Metformin will sensitize cells to insulin. Metformin will change absorption of glucose. It seems to do that. That's part of why they think that has some of that effects on the gut and changing gut flora and stuff too. So metformin also will change the amount of hepatic glucose output, so from the liver, right? But the one thing you see with metformin is it's not really an insulin mimetic like some of the GDAs that we might take. Right? It's not like we take it and it directly lowers the blood sugar right when you take it. We don't really see that so much with metformin. So there, I would say you don't need to take it post-workout with a bolus. You don't even need to take it with carbohydrate at all. Just take it. Just take it sometimes. Knowing what it does with hepatic glucose, I almost tell people, well, if you're going to take one dose a day, probably take it at bed with your last meal perhaps, because we're having that hepatic glucose output throughout the night. That's kind of what's keeping our blood sugar stable. I mean, we have it throughout the day too, but throughout the night, especially because we're not eating, and cortisol rising in the morning and stuff, right? So if you're worried about it, one, you don't need to take it with a large amount of carbohydrates. You can just take it with a meal or split it between AM and PM meal or whatever. And secondly, the other thing would be that we know anecdotally a bunch of people take it and it doesn't cause blunting of muscle gain. So we have that. So the real question is, like, we know that it has these effects on AMPK and mTOR and lowers androgens, which it's not going to lower androgens when you're taking androgens exogenously, but from everything we've seen, it's definitely not affecting people's ability to gain muscle. And in fact, by helping them maintain a better insulin sensitivity, is probably helping them gain muscle, especially those taking exogenous androgens or PEDs, right? The answer is don't worry about it. Take it. You don't need to take it with carbohydrates. You just take it away from your training if you're worried about it, right? Can you explain how reducing caffeine intake may assist with increasing natural energy levels? I've reduced my daily intake and noticed that I have better energy during the workouts and throughout the day. Well, I mean, it's not that it's necessarily directly increasing energy output. It's just that you are not having peaks and valleys. Your nervous system is designed to respond when it needs to. It's designed to produce dopamine. It's designed to stimulate based on activity like training, right? Because training is going to give you a sympathetic response to your nervous system, as does caffeine. Now, you can get this response without taking it. Your body will do it on its own. It's just that folks are so desensitized to caffeine that they feel like they need it, right? And then you realize, wow, you feel a lot better without it sometimes. I mean, and that's of course depending on how much of it you're using. I mean, if you're using it in smaller doses or not every day or whatever, you're probably still going to get a pretty good effect from it, right? But it's just when you get to a point where you aren't feeling it or you're needing more, then you're probably going to feel worse taking it, simply because you're always like trying to just maintain this nervous system response, and you're just crash, or you're just living in this state of crash, and you're never able to quite stimulate the CNS like you were initially with caffeine, right? Like, hence why you get that response initially for a little while and then you don't feel it anymore. So it's just more of a desensitizing thing, but your body is perfectly capable. Like, caffeine's not doing anything that your body can't do on its own, right? It's just that it does it when you want it to do it. It's more of like an instant thing, and more, it'll do it right now if you take the caffeine, or in 20 minutes from now or whatever, right? So yeah, I just think it's more of a dose dependent thing. If you're certainly more reliant on caffeine, you're going to feel worse probably using it than you do off of it, besides like a little lag period there where you resensitize to it after you stop. People are surprised that, like, it doesn't take that long. I mean, you come off and stop using it even for a few days, even after chronic use, and a lot of people start to feel better. So it's not as bad as people think. It's just kind of scary. All right, a few more. How do you use insulin during a diet phase? Are there any downsides? Is any way to inhibit fat loss? I'm not sure if that's what they're asking exactly, but I don't really see much point in doing it, to be honest. I mean, you should be becoming more insulin sensitive as you get leaner and as you reduce calories, so I don't really see much point in even using it. I don't think they ask, are there any downsides? I mean, you can still lose body fat when you use it. I mean, it may inhibit some lipolysis like acutely, but you're still calories in, calories out essentially. But I mean, there's just no point in using it. I mean, it's not going to do anything. If anything, your insulin requirements are going down because you're eating less and you're becoming more insulin sensitive, so your requirements are going down and down and down. There's just no point in using it at that time. It's not going to do anything, right? So I mean, other than maybe like huge refeed or something like that. I mean, but even then, you're not going to need much because you should be pretty sensitive at that time. So it's not that there's many downsides, but obviously if you use too much, you would need to eat more to compensate, and that would ruin your diet, but no real point. Would your programming for a bodybuilder after a multiple cervical spinal fusion change based on surgery? And if so, what would you change? What changes would you make? Well, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to do with your training if you've had a C-spine fusion, but I can give you some general thoughts. I mean, that's like a pretty big medical thing. I don't know anything about the person, so would rather not give any like definitive answers to that. But what I'll say is, we know we're talking C-spine, so we're talking cervical up at the neck, right? Now, I've never had a client with a cervical spinal fusion, though I've had a lumbar spinal fusion. Now, cervical is gonna be a little different because you could still do a lot of the same stuff, I would think, with the C-spine fusion. Loading the spine directly might be a problem. You may, depending on where they fused it at, you may have a problem with like loading a barbell on your back or loading a pad like hack squat, stuff like that. Depending on how low down on that C-spine that they did the fusion, because the C-spine is really only kind of going down to the trap area and then that's it. So that's kind of iffy on that one. Any type of like hip hinging RDL deadlift type stuff like that, you could probably still perform if you kept your spine pretty neutral and you're keeping your head, everything flat. I don't see why that would be a problem. I mean, again, like, I'm not going to give you a definitive answer, but I don't see why that would be a problem. Other than that, anything that's not involving that area, I mean, you could certainly leg press for leg training, like, leg extensions, leg curls, glute ham raises, all that type of stuff would be perfectly fine. So, I mean, again, like the squatting and loading a bar on the spine might be a little iffy. Again, just depends on how sensitive that area is and where they did the fusion. But that would probably be like a general thing to consider. Rowing, stuff like that should be okay, as long as, again, keeping a pretty neutral spine. Pressing, yeah. And of course, some things might be uncomfortable or awkward at first, and you'd have to kind of maybe make some adjustments based on what you feel. But for the most part, I would think those things would be pretty acceptable. Dealing with waist midsection thickening and advanced aging, 50 plus. No appreciable fat gain, but skin appears thicker, some stubborn fat in lower abs, pudge, wider appearance, blockier. It could be a number of things. I mean, it could be appreciable fat gain. You just maybe it's happened extremely slowly, and that's why it doesn't seem like fat gain. It's just you've gained subcutaneous fat. Maybe possibly how the distribution of fat in your body has changed over time between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat, intramuscular fat. Also, any type of the abdominal wall and the oblique wall, transverse abdominal, and all these areas, the strength of those areas and ability to kind of hold that form, right? We see that with people that are bodybuilders. Like, it's always the bigger bodybuilders always seems to be the ones to have that, but because they eat a lot of food, so a lot of people blame it on that or some kind of drug thing. But those areas weaken, perhaps, depending on how they're trained and what you're doing. That would be another one, just that the muscular wall weakening and some of that expansion. So it's giving you that blockier look. On the flip side, the muscular wall grew from training because I mean, it is a muscle and it looks, again, blockier. But I mean, that could be a few different things that you may consider, but also just fat gain over time. Also, fat distribution changes in the body based on hormones too. I kind of talked about that in one of the earlier questions. There's definitely something to be said about how the fat is distributed throughout the adipose cells as time goes on. As the hormone profile changes, you could potentially see some, not necessarily an overall fat gain in the body, but definitely a change in fat distribution. So, I mean, those are some things to consider. But I mean, I'm like throwing stuff at the wall here because I don't really know much about you or how it actually looks or what the context is or what's happened in the last 10 years to really leading up to that, you know, so it'd be difficult to say. But yeah, those are some general thoughts. So, okay, that is it. I appreciate the questions from everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.